Hello, this is Lynne Wilson, and I'm excited to share some thoughts with you today about the period of 1827, 1826, 1825, when Joseph begins working for Mr. Stoll. He goes down to Harmony, he marries Emma, the Smiths lose their house, and he begins translating, and the 116 first pages are lost. There are so many wonderful details about this time period that we find in the Joseph Smith Papers Project. And I hope that some of your hard questions will be answered as well. As long as we approach our questions with faith and humility and meekness, I feel that searching church history can bolster your testimony. It can bolster your understanding of the way God works with man, humanity, and the way that we can draw closer to Him. Some of the hard questions that my students came up with, which may not be yours: why did it take 3 years between the time he got the plate and was finished with the translation? What was Joseph's magic and money digging all about? Why so secretive about the plates? And why didn't Joseph have to bring the right person in order to get them? Why were Emma's parents so opposed to their marriage? Now, there are dozens more questions, and I won't even touch on even all of these, but I hope that as we look deeply into this period of history, you will be able to feel the Spirit of the Lord and have a better understanding of the human nature in all of us. As a timeline, just to keep things in perspective, Alvin had passed away in 1823 from bilious colic, whatever that one exactly meant. Emma meets Joseph 2 years later, that autumn, as he's working down in Harmony, Pennsylvania area. By December, the Smiths lose the ownership of their farm and begin renting it back to from a new owner. The new year began with Joseph and Emma eloping. We're married in January, South Bainbridge, New York, January 18th. On September 21st, Joseph and Emma go to Hilton and receive the plates. That December, they arrive back in Harmony, and Emma is expecting. January 1828 begins with the translation of the Book of Mormon with Emma and her brother Reuben as the first scribes. By February 1828, Martin takes some of the characters and the translation that Emma has scribed back to Columbia University and asks three of the scholars there for their input on this translation that Joseph had produced. Martin then returns and helps scribe for Joseph's translation on the book of Lehi. They also get through the first 2 chapters of Mosiah, and it makes up 116 pages. At the completion of that translation, of that part, Martin leaves because Emma is expecting any day, and sure enough, she goes into labor the day after he leaves. It's another miracle of timing, but unfortunately, her little baby dies, and she almost does. And we'll go through the loss of the 116 pages all the way up to the point where Joseph's parents come to visit, and section 4 of the Doctrine and Covenants is given. On our last lecture, we went all the way through the point where Joseph and his mother was writing about how seriously he took his preparation, that he no longer was the jovial boy, but his spare time in between working very long hours was spent searching the Bible and preparing his heart and soul. I really love reading about his preparation. The Lord did not just come and give him answers. He really had to work. The spiritual preparation was very significant between the 17-and-a-half-year-old boy and the 21-year-old, and we'll look at some of those details. Lucy remembers back to 1925, at the time when the Smith boys, and actually their father as well, were often hired out to do day jobs in order to get cash payments to help cover the mortgage costs on their property. usually it was just people in the neighborhood. But when news of Joseph's young man being able to find gold plates in a mountainside spread in the area, even though Joseph doesn't have the plates, the news still spread and cleared down to Pennsylvania. And Mr. Stoll comes up through the burned over district to find the Smiths and their neighborhood to give them a very enticing price. I think I mentioned last week that a usual day laborer was between $1.25 and $1.75, depending on how trained they were as a day laborer. But if you were a professional cabinet maker, you received more, or a professional builder, then you'd receive more. But Mr. Stoll comes clear up the 140 miles to hunt out Joseph, and the offer was too good to be refused, even though what he wanted was digging through the mountain to see. For some reason, there was a lot of ideas that this land that was just being opened to the American, or as a United States settlers, it actually had been previously owned by people who buried their treasures there. And this Mr. Stoll was one of those who felt like his property had a silver mine, or a Spanish had buried something. There's different accounts and different reports stating exactly what he thought it was. So he was hired out to use his seer stone in what was called at that time money digging. And then, but it wasn't just Mr. Stoll. When Joseph and his father and a few of the neighbors in Palmyra left and went down to work in northern Pennsylvania, they realized that the whole community was in on it. Jason Tidwell and even Mr. Hale was in on the project. And Mr. Hale opened up one of his small log homes on his property. The original home that he first built when he arrived there on the Susquehanna was turned into a lodging. And his family was helping to feed and house those people that were hired to come and dig. And the family, the Hale family did not live too far away. And Emma was working there for these people that were lodging there as one of the cooks. Lucy reports that Mr. Stoll was inflexible and offered high wages as to such would dig for him. Consequently, he returned to the old gentleman would be Mr. Stoll, and besides several others who were picked up in the neighborhood and commenced digging. After laboring about a month without success, Joseph prevailed on his employer to cease his operation. So Joseph's experience as a money digger, which becomes one of the labels that is used against him for years and decades and maybe even centuries, was actually a few weeks. It was less than a month. But the experience allowed him to meet Emma. And she was tall and thin and beautiful and educated and capable. She was really an outdoorsy kind of girl. Her nickname was Emmy. She loved horseback riding. She also had been trained in a medical field. I think it was called Anderson or Thompson medicine, where they believed there should be a lot of boiling water in the house when people are ill. And by drinking a lot and having a lot of moisture, hot steam in the house, it helped. And she always had, she was always training someone. The most of the rest of her life, she always had, what's it called if you come in and you're acting as a protege? Anyway, she had people training with her in most of their married life because of her skill in so many areas. When the family came down to this, Joseph returned up to see his family, and he traveled the 140 miles and actually mentioned to his mom and dad that he wanted to marry Emma. I don't know exactly when he went up. The way that Lucy records this story, it comes right before they lose their home, that Joseph comes up. So was he and his father returning in order to help with the housing? Perhaps, but I'm not exactly sure on that date. But they began building this frame house in 1822. It's finished by 1824. You remember Alvin died in 23. So Alvin begins the house, but the family arrives, they buy the farm, or they put the first money down on this 100-acre farm back in 1818. And they're all living first in the part of the farm that Hiram bought for he and his future family. And so they're there for 4 years, actually 4, 5, 6 years, 1818 to 1825, almost 7 years, before they can move into this home. And the backstory on this that comes out of neighborhood talk and references is that Lucy was at a social gathering with lots of the women, and she overheard some of the neighbors say, Mrs. Smith is so refined and intelligent and wonderful. It's such a shame that her husband can't provide more than just a log cabin for her. And so it is surmised by some historians that when Lucy overheard this, the money that they had been saving for that year's mortgage and the next year's mortgage had not been picked up by the landowner. And they used part of that was due for the mortgage payments on supplies for the house. And they began building the house immediately. And so when the owner finally shows up, or the land agent, in 1825 for the payment, they don't have all of it ready. And the real problem is even Joseph's father is not at home. They're down in northern Pennsylvania. And so poor Hiram and the rest of the family run to the neighbors and see if anyone can help them. And it's an absolute tragic time. Some accounts say that it was on Christmas Day that all this is coming to the pass. One of their neighbors that was a dear friend, Dr. Robinson, goes around to the residents of Palmyra that knew the Smiths and could vouch for them, and received 60 signatures that said, this family has done an amazing job on their property, the way that they have taken care of it and are building a new home, that we would really like them as neighbors, and let's please just extend this situation a little bit longer. The crazy thing is they're getting paid overtime right now for this money digging, and if they could just finish up that period there, they would probably have a more cash payment to meet part of the requirement. But the land agent did not go and look at the property, and someone had reported that they were burning neighbors' houses, they were burning down trees, they had totally trashed, they were ne'er-do-wells and negligent, and the land agent never went out to the Smiths' property to see how much they had done. And the way that land sales went in that early Western movement of the United States, it was so different. You know, there's so many stories about people, if you can just live on the land for a few years, then you can have the opportunity to buy it. Or if you improve the property, they did it very differently than we do now. It's the bottom line. And Dr. Robinson's signatures were not observed, but the family was able to, with the help of Dr. Robinson and others, contact a Quaker that lived in the area named Lemuel Durfee, and he was able to buy the farm and then rent it back to the Smiths. And that's what happens from 2000, that's what happens from 18 until 1829. So that December of 25 until 1829, the family is living there in their own home and taking care of their own farm. But when Lemuel Durfee's daughter is married, the family gives it to her, and the Smiths move out, and they all go back into the little farm log cabin that is Hiram's. By this time, of course, Hiram's married Jerusha and has children. And they still work part of the property, though, over on Hiram's 80 acres. I want to mention something about the Quakers. I found this fabulous chart. I showed you a smaller one a few lessons ago on the different denominations in the United States and how they grew between 1770 and almost a century later, 1860. This one's done by one of my favorite American historians. His name is Mark Knoll, and you'll find a lot of work by him if you're interested in studying more of American religious history. But this is evidence that the Quakers were not welcome. And I think I mentioned also prior to that some of the boats that would come in on the eastern seaboard from Europe, if they were not the correct religion, they would be turned around without even a supply of water. The Quakers were one of those groups that were shunned and not welcomed. You can see even as late as the late 18th century, 1770, right before the constitutional conventions and the beginning of our new nation, there are only 228 Quakers. I'm trying to see what the Catholics are at that time. See, there's 50 Catholics and 228, the Quakers. So very, very few compared to other other church buildings, other churches, other members. But by the time Mr. Lemuel comes around, we're a little bit later. So they're between 400 and 600 members in there. And I think one reason why he was so willing to help the Smiths may have been that he was also religiously persecuted and hence was willing to shake a hand with another family that was religiously persecuted. Anyway, that's beautiful. Again, I don't know for sure if this is really December 1825 because it takes Joseph a whole nother year before he convinces Emma to marry him, but this is what Lucy recorded that happened at this time. I just don't know for sure if the date's accurate. Joseph called my husband and myself aside and said, I have been very lonely ever since Alvin died. So it's been 2 years since Alvin's death. And I have concluded to get married. And if you have no objections, Miss Emma Hale would be my choice before any other woman that I have ever seen. According to George A. Smith, I think it was, Emma was the most beautiful woman in the world. But far more than that, she had a nature and a character. And I believe this marriage was arranged in heaven. And even though Joseph asked his parents' permission and received very positive, in fact, Lucy even said, when you get married, bring her back here and live with us. But that is not how he was received by his father-in-law. Isaac Hale wrote years later after he met Joseph, young Smith made several visits at my house and at length asked my consent to marry my daughter Emma. Remember, they met in 25 and they're married in late 27, so a year and a half or something. This I refused. I gave him my reasons for so doing, some of which were that he was a stranger and followed a business that I could not approve. He then left the place. Now, even though Joseph stopped the money digging after a month, he was such a great employee that the locals asked him to stay and work for them. And pretty soon, the one he started with the money digging didn't have enough money. And so Joseph Knight asked him to come 30 miles north. You know, on Google Maps, I can give you the distance 30, but many people suggest that it's 36 in that day and age if you're walking on the horse trails, you know, or the pig trails, as they used to call them. But I have to tell you a little bit about Mr. Hale. When he comes to Susquehanna, he's one of the first white men in this area. And he and his wife come from New England and settle down in one of the most beautiful places in northern Pennsylvania, right here along the Susquehanna. And he has a small house and he continues to buy more and more land. He was a hunter. And because he was there so early, he is very well respected in the community. And by the time Joseph meets Emma, he and his oldest sons are quite well-to-do. They own the store in the area. They're in the city councils or the local jurisdictions. And their home has wallpaper on the walls, which was a sign of real wealth, instead of just whitewashed plaster. They have a reputation to keep up. And they are not too impressed with a day worker. He says here, I wasn't interested in his business, but I think that Isaac Stoll was just more worried about the reputation of someone who claimed to have seen or angels and to have a golden Bible. But Emma, in January, went up to visit her sister Elizabeth, a day or two's journey up to near Colesville, New York. And Joseph is staying with Joseph Knight. And as long as she's up there visiting her sister, she goes over to see Joseph. And good old Mr. Knight, Sr., was like his wingman. And he encourages Emma to marry him. And Joseph obviously proposes, and Emma is worried that her family is not in favor, and so Mr. Knight encourages her to elope with him. And they go over a few towns away to South Bainbridge, where a Judge Tarbell lives. And this is significant. This is the judge when Joseph was being sued by someone for disorderly conduct. This is the judge who went through all the facts and said, no, Joseph, you're fine. You have not had any disorderly conduct. These are all malicious lies to vilify your character. And they choose him to be the one who marries them as a prior friend. Emma was 22 at the time. Joseph had just turned 21. And Emma remembers years later about this when she's asked by Joseph III, her son, I had no intention of marrying when I left home, but during my visit, Mr. Stolz, your father visited me there. My folks were bitterly opposed to him, but being opportuned by your father and aided by Mr. Stoll, who urged me to marry and preferring to marry him to any other man I knew, I consented. Joseph then leaves the employ of Mr. Knight and takes Emma back up to Palmyra, New York, and moves in with the family to their farmhouse. And Lucy is thrilled to have her there, welcomes her with open arms, but there is evidence that it was difficult for Emma. Letters going back and forth and communication with friends would suggest that she wasn't used to living quite so modestly, and it was difficult for her. But between their January marriage and the time that they begin thinking about leaving in October and November, she conceives, and she is in her first trimester when Joseph goes to get the plates that September. September 22nd was a date that many people knew of by now. And so just happen chance, Joseph Knight happens to come up and visit the 100 miles north to the Smith family on September 20th. And he stays there in the frame house with them, as well as many other people. And Joseph is afraid that one neighbor in particularly, the Lawrences, who have threatened to cause a lot of havoc, will be there that afternoon or evening on the 22nd. And so Joseph chooses to leave right after midnight, the time that you take the red eye and you get confused which day you're on. That's what time he left. Right as soon as the 22nd arrived, he goes. And he comes downstairs to the home, and his mother, actually I should go back up here for that picture. His mother is still awake. She said she had much work to do. And I just want you to remember back of what it would have been like without a well in your home and without electricity, and the idea of making your cloth before you even begin sewing and canning from your garden. I just cannot imagine the amount of work that women and men had to go through for most of the history of the world in order to put bread and butter on their tables. But Mother Smith was still awake when Emmy comes downstairs in her riding clothes. And Joseph asks his mother, do you have a box with a lock on it? And she said no. But she knew exactly what was going on. She put two and two together very quickly in her journal. And she is very worried about actually getting there a locked box. And he says, don't worry, Mother, I'll take care of it. And I'm just sort of surprised. Why hadn't he gotten this before? But again, I'm looking at it from my perspective, where that would have been something that I would have thought could have been reserved, but it wasn't. And he calms his mother down, and he borrows, without asking, Mr. Knight's wagon to go the 3 miles to Cumorah. He's already seen the plates. He's already seen the things he'll be bringing back, the breastplate and the spectacles. But they were heavy. Joseph says there were about 60 pounds or 40 pounds at sometimes. Other accounts give different numbers between 40 and 60 pounds. Actually, I think there was one account by a third hand that said 30 pounds, but I'll stick with the other estimates. That seems to be a little more accurate. And they wanted the wagon to be able to do it. And he needed Emma there. As we talked in our last class about the different visits that Joseph came, and Moroni had told him the first time, you have to bring the right person. Who is it? It's Alvin. And Joseph trusted Alvin. He felt so good about that. But if Alvin passes away, he dies. I think he was poisoned by that mercury poisoning. And the next year, he gets the shock. He rolls down the hill. He puts the plates down or whatever it was. He can't take them. He still hasn't learned to control his thoughts and obey with exactness. So this time, he brings Emma, but much to my surprise, Emma doesn't go up the hill. Emma stays down in the wagon, sort of as the lookout, as the guardian. And I'm thinking, Emma's going to be the guardian, but she's in the wagon with a horse. So he brings her to the hill, goes up to talk to Moroni, and they get there, shortly after midnight, and Joseph doesn't come down for hours. So there was obviously some training and talking going on. But from what we know now in history, I don't think Emma ever went up the hill. That by having her there was sufficient enough. When Moroni said, you have to bring the right person, Joseph looks in the seer stone and he sees Emma, and the marriage had to take place ahead of time in order for this to happen. And then Joseph goes up the hill and gets the plates. But why was September 22nd so important? I don't know if you've had a chance to see the Book of Mormon Central Know Why on September 22nd, but they do a fabulous job going back into the Jewish calendar and looking at what that date meant then. I believe that timing is very important to the Lord. It's important, especially on holy days. And the holiest day of the year in the Jewish calendar was the Day of Atonement. And the week preceding that, or in conjunction with that, the Feast of the Tabernacles, as they reenact the Feast of Booths, where they're remembering back to the time when the Israelites are traveling the 40 years in the wilderness. They often read the entire law during that period of time. They have coronations. Solomon was coronated at that time. Many sacred, important events happened then. And if we look in the Book of Mormon, we can see evidence of this fall Israelite holiday being celebrated there. In fact, even with the coronation of King Benjamin's sermon, fits in perfectly to what happened there. But this most sacred day of the year, the Day of Atonement, is the one day that the high priest is allowed to go in to the Holy of Holies. And he cleanses himself. He changes out of his beautiful colored garments with the embroidered pomegranates, and he wears the white linen, and he first has a sacrifice for all of Israel and then for himself. Then you get the scapegoat, the two goats, the one that becomes the scapegoat and the one that represents Israel, and he puts the sins of Israel on the scapegoat's head. All this is so beautifully symbolic of our Savior's atonement and his sacrifice for us. That's the Day of Atonement. It's L-E-V. Leviticus 16 is where you can get that story if you want to refresh your memory on all the things that happened there, where the one high priest goes in once a year through the veil into the Holy of Holies. The only day that the high priest is allowed to go through, he prays at the veil, offers sacrifice at the veil, communes with God at the veil, and then is allowed to enter into his presence. And the symbolism of this high priest standing before a veil and then entering into God's presence is also part of our temple ceremony. So September 22nd in 1823, the 17-and-a-half-year-old Joseph, who's praying in his bed and has Moroni's visitations starting on the 21st and ending on the other extra 3 on the 22nd, was during the Feast of the Tabernacles. It was during this autumn festival that the law was reread and had great significance to not only the ancient Israelites in Jerusalem, but the ancient Israelites in the New World. On the 24th, the second year he went, it was the eve of the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, 1825. Remember, there's all sorts of different calendars. The Jewish calendar is based on a lunar calendar, and obviously we were on a solar calendar. So the days, even though they're all on September 22nd, they were different for the Jewish calendar. In 1825, when he went, it was the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. And in 1827, the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, and Feast of the Trumpets were on this day. I just think this is one of the most significant events in the history of the church, that without knowing, Joseph is fulfilling thousands of years of prophecies of sacred days and events that happened. And you can read about it also in Leviticus 23 as well as 16. And here's the know why, in case you want to take a picture of this to be able to watch it, or else just type in know why September 22nd. When Joseph gets back to the wagon, he does not have the plates. He has already hollowed out an old birch log and hides the plates there. It's about 3 miles from their home, and Emma is still waiting there. And I just hope she had a thick blanket. I just cannot imagine upstate New York in January outside. But I assume that she also spent her hours in prayer. And I feel prayers make such a difference. When I was going through chemo, I had 100 days of people fasting and praying for me. And I felt so lifted and joyous and happy that I am one who believes the more prayers, the better. And I hope that you and I were up in heaven praying for Joseph and Emma on September 22nd, 1827 as well. That prayers come both directions and that angels are sent and protection was granted. Now, when he gets back to the house that morning, I think it's just about dawn. For some reason, 6 a.m. is in my head, but I really don't remember the exact time. Lucy sees he's not carrying the plates. And Lucy had also said that in her records that she stayed up that night praying, that she did not sleep. And she is just devastated. It has now been 4 years, the 5th time he comes home without the plates. And it sounds as if she turned around and went into the kitchen or something, and Joseph follows after her and says, "Mother, it's okay." And he takes in his hand and gives her a little handkerchief. She wrote, "Mother," he said, "do not be uneasy at all. All is right. See here," said he, "I have got the key." I know not what he meant, but took the article in my hands, and upon examining it with no covering but a silk handkerchief, I found that it consisted of 2 smooth, 3-cornered diamonds set in glass, and the glass was set in silver bows, connected with each other in the same way that old-fashioned spectacles were made. Now, other people have described these to be so big that you could see both eyes out of one spectacle. There's other people given their own definitions, but they seem to somehow fit onto, even though they were quite large, onto a breastplate. And Lucy later says, the 3-cornered diamonds set in the glass. Oh, this is the same quote. Never mind. Lucy was able to feel them through this silk handkerchief, and many other people were able to see them and feel them and give us their account as well. In those secondhand accounts, we have that the plates are somewhere between 40 and 60 pounds, that the gold Bible or the golden plates were about 6 inches by 8 inches. And Emma said as she was doing the dusting, they just had, one table in their home down in Harmony. And as she's doing her cleaning and things, she would move the plates and she could hear them rustle like pieces of tin. And they just had her little silk handkerchief over them in that first year that the translation took so long to get that 116 pages. But the neighborhood went crazy when they learned that Joseph had them. And raids were constantly made looking for that Bible. Joseph moved them and transferred them from this birch log to a box. Hiram had a box, and Joseph went and worked for a day to get one with a key and bought another one, and they put them inside, actually took out parts of their chimney and put them in there. Another time he took out the floorboards and put them in. Another time out in the coopers, remember Joseph's father was a cooper, put him out in the cooper shed and moved them from underneath the floorboards up to the flax, under the flax in the cooper shed. And then the famous story about the beans. Now this picture here shows the beans all the way full. According to eyewitnesses, the bean barrel was only a third full of beans. So it wasn't quite this overflowing, but it's still a great picture. One of the neighbors that was a problem was Miss Sally Chase, and she had a green piece of glass that she looked in, and she told the ruffians in the neighborhood that she could see where the plates were kept. And she was very close to being right many times. A group of this mob came looking for them because she said that they were in the cooper shop and that they were under the floorboards. And so the mob comes in and tears up the floor, and there is a box. And they're thrilled, and they smash it open. And no need for a lock if you're going to just use an axe to smash it open. And the box is empty. That's when Joseph had moved them up into the flax on top of the cooper's loft, the roof line. Joseph kept the Urim and Thummim always with him, and as he looked in the glass, he could tell where the plates were. And when he felt comfortable that they were safe, he would go hire out again for day labor. And someone asked him to dig a well. And so he is there for a few days digging this well. This is extremely difficult work. Takes days and days. And of course, there's always the chance of the gases coming in and killing you. So people either put a candle down first, or else sometimes they'd use a little bird. I know in England, even in the mine work, they'd put a little bird in, and if the bird died, they knew that there was poisonous gases down there, and they had to wait until a rain or a wind or something. And Joseph is digging this well, and he's constantly looking at his Urim and Thummim to make sure things are fine. And he sees another mob coming, but they're going in the wrong direction. He knows right where the plates are. He's not worried about them. And then he sees that Emma is coming. Emma heard about the mob from a family member, jumps on a horse, and she was a good rider, and goes as fast as she can to get there. And Joseph has come out of the well and walked down the road and meets her. And in her breathless state, she's so frightened. And Joseph shows her the Urim and Thummim that shows where the plates are and says, it's fine, but I'm so glad you're here. And one account says that Joseph left with her then to go home, that there was enough. I don't know exactly if that was accurate. But the persecution that Joseph received in that first few months from September until he left that area was preparation for what was to come. And for some reason, the Lord allowed it to happen. He could have stopped it, but he did not. And just like our Savior, who was willing to endure what God had planned him to endure, Joseph also, and his wife and his family, endured their hard times because it was all a learning process. And one of my favorite scriptures in the Doctrine and Covenants, section 122, verse 7, all these things will give thee experience and be for thy good. And I recite that to myself 100 times a day. All these things were for Joseph's preparation and making him the humble servant of the Lord that he became. So later that fall, 1827, Joseph is, I think I just said something wrong about how many months they had the plates. He gets them September and they leave that fall. And they're home in Harmony by December 3rd because there's a tax record that has the fact that they are there living. And so we don't know, some records say they arrived the 1st, but by the 3rd we have a documented account that the tax records show that he was living there. And for some reason, it took a long time for them. Emma is in her first trimester in her pregnancy, and so Joseph insists that they not ride quickly. Joseph I should probably have told you this already. Joseph had already written Emma's brother, Alva, not Alvin, but Alva, to come and get them, bring a wagon up, and that they would come back. Emma had also written her parents prior to this and said, may I have my things? She had a milk cow. I forgot to tell you that. She made cheese. Emma had her milk cow and her clothing. She had her own furnishings. And she said, may I have my things? And her father responded, to Joseph, you stole my daughter. But yes, you may have all your things. And so they felt like they were welcome back there. And to leave the persecution, they left and went down with Alva. And Moroni did not come and take the plates. Joseph had hardly done any work on deciphering how to translate at this time because he had been so busy protecting them and making ends meet at home. But Alva was willing to protect the plates at that point. The problem is Alva arrived in late October, and he moves in with the Smiths as well into the frame house, into one of the rooms, but they did not have enough money. They had to still pay off some debts. And one of those debts was to Lucy Harris. She wanted to give $28 to Joseph Smith. By the way, Lucy Harris was called Dolly, so I'll just call her Dolly Harris, even though her first name was Lucy. And Joseph wanted to be able to earn the money to pay it back. So when Alva arrived, they weren't quite ready yet. And they are in a local, in Palmyra, at a store of some sort, several people in the store when Martin Harris walks in. And one of the people there was Alva Smith, Emmy's little big brother. And Emmy's the baby of the family. And Martin Harris comes into the store and has a bag of silver or gold or some sort of form of money and says to Joseph, I give this to you in front of all these witnesses out of my heart to do the work of the Lord. And then Joseph uses part of the money that Martin gave to him to pay back Dolly, Martin's wife, to do the reimbursement. But Martin gave him 50, and he only owed Lucy or Dolly 28 or 26. So it was interesting to see how that husband and wife relationship was working even on financial matters. But they finally get everything settled. They're able to leave earlier thanks to Martin Harris's generosity, and they head down to Harmony. It takes a long time. He's worried about the pregnancy, so they stay in a taverns on the way down, don't travel too much every day so that Emmy is able to make the trip even during this very uncomfortable first trimester of her pregnancy when she's so sick. They finally arrive, and very soon after they get there is when Martin and Dolly come. These two were married. They were first cousins. Martin was 25, and his beautiful first cousin was 16. But over the course of her life, she loses some of her hearing, and she becomes quite suspicious. They're very wealthy. When Martin marries, his father gives him a farm of 240 acres. And over the years, he is able to add to that. And by the time Joseph knows him, it's over 300 acres. And he is one of the wealthiest men in the community, and his wife wants to keep it that way. When Lucy or Dolly finds out that there's this golden Bible around and that her husband is interested, she wants to become interested. And she asks Joseph if she can be a witness. And of course, Joseph says, no, the Lord has told me I can't show anyone. And she gets mad and she yells at him, and she said, I'll give you $28 if you can, $28 worth, whatever, if you will let me see them. And he says, I'm not going to be bribed into this. And so she goes home, and that night she has a dream. At least this is her account, that she has a dream, and Lucy Smith recorded it, that a personage appeared to her and said, here are the plates. You never should have spoken to Joseph Smith Jr. like that. He is a prophet of God. You have offended the Lord's anointed, and now that you have seen the plates, I want you to support him. So that's when she offers him the $28, and Lucy thinks, at least, Lucy Smith believes that Dolly did see these things, and I still am reticent to say she did because her actions very quickly become someone who was not one who had seen them in a dream. I think she was using the story, but we'll see. Hopefully by now up in heaven, she's in a good place and it'll be a little bit easier for her. She and Martin had children, but their marriage was always rocky. And she becomes very possessive of Martin's money and farm and really does not like him spending time. In February of 1828, they come down. So Joseph and Emma have been there a month or two, and they come down to visit, and she asks again if she can see the plates. Joseph again recites, "No, I am sorry. That's not part of the plan of God. I have got to obey with exactness." You know, he's been tutored. He knows exactly that he does not need to fear humanity. He needs to fear God. And Lucy starts tearing through their home. I forgot to tell you about their home. They first move in when they first arrive into the home that Emma grew up in with Isaac and Elizabeth Hale. But they are able to buy part of the family's farm, and another family member was already living in a little log cabin on this beautiful, the best 13 acres of the whole property. And as soon as they leave for a larger home, Joseph and Emmy are able to put down some money, and they secure these 13 acres for themselves. And so I assume that Martin and Lucy are in the small log cabin. Martin and Dolly are in the small cabin with Joseph and Emmy. But I wasn't able to find accurate accounts of exactly which bed they're sleeping in. But the bottom line is, Dolly tears through everything. She opens all the cupboards. She goes through the pillows. She's opening up the feather beds. It's a tiny little thing, and she's just tearing everything apart, looking for this. So she doesn't really have much attention to personal space. And we have some of these accounts of their stories, but she moves out, Dolly moves out and moves into the neighbors and spreads rumors and lies and gets the persecution growing there in Harmony, and then leaves. Martin finally leaves and takes her home. But Martin comes back shortly thereafter because he feels prompted to take some of the characters and Joseph's translation that Emma and Emma's oldest brother Reuben has made on paper from Joseph's translation back east to the people that might know. And I don't know if Martin knew at that time that Isaiah had prophesied of this. But this is a copy or a picture of the characters. You can see how they spelled characters from the plates. So if you want to know what Reformed Egyptian looked like to Mormon, so 1,000 years after the time that Nephi arrives, and Lehi's, that he said, we called it Reformed Egyptian, you know, this Hebraic Egyptian combination. 1,000 years later, Moroni said, well, we're calling our language now Reformed Egyptian, but there's a huge diversity. And any linguist who studies languages know you're going to get changes in 100 years, let alone in 1,000 years, especially in an area without even a printing press. So these were the characters that Mormon is editing from the book of Lehi, probably. And Emma is the first scribe. But because of the challenges of living out on the frontier, they do not have a lot of time to make much. But there is a small translation. These characters are written down, and Martin is the one to take it back east. Now, at this time, no one in the United States could read Egyptian. But we did have 5 scholars who were educated in Europe and read many classical languages. One of them, Charles Anthon, was a professor at Columbia University in the classics. So at least he knew Latin, Greek, Hebrew, a smattering of Arabic, but there were others as well. There were 5 people that spoke the classics languages in the nation, that taught them, and I shouldn't have said spoke, but could read them. And there's only 5. I mean, I was just blown away when I was learning about this. But the more I studied about American religious history, the more I realized we didn't have the university capacity to do that. So you had to be sent back to Europe to receive your education. And in a poor country that's just starting out, not too many people had that opportunity. Charles Hodge did. There's a handful of scholars at the time of Joseph who were educated in Europe. 5 of them in the classics had come back to the United States, and Martin Harris spoke to a few of them about this translation. He was a witness, but reticent. He was constantly looking for evidence, and I think it was inspired, not only because he's fulfilling Isaiah, but because it quieted the mouths of critics. The Rosetta Stone had not yet been publicized in the United States. Now, it was found, you remember the story about Napoleon's army down there and everything. They find this Rosetta Stone, and there's been other Rosetta Stones found as well. When I went, the British Museum has this one. And when I went and studied it, I understood better why it took decades for the translation to be completed. But the first translation was finished in 22, and I believe it was published in 24, and that's why I put this 24. This is the information from the British Museum, but I'm sure there's other places to get little innuendos on the Rosetta Stone if you're interested online. So all I'm trying to say is that the New York folks did not read Egyptian, and they knew, and of course this Reformed Egyptian is something completely different. But I just want to remind you that when Lehi left Jerusalem in 600 BC, there is a lot of travel, and the languages of combining the Hebrew and the Egyptian at 600 BC was not uncommon. There was a lot of travel. According to Hugh Nibley, it was one of the most free travel times in the ancient world. There was a great level of civility, and people communicated and read each other's languages and were combining them. It's also interesting that from 600 BC, the oldest scripture ever found in Jerusalem is a little silver scroll that has the priestly benediction on it from the books of Moses, the 5 books of the Torah. The Lord bless you and keep you, and may his face shine upon you. That's the priestly benediction. It's on a silver scroll dating to 600 BC. So the oldest scripture we have is on metal in Jerusalem, and it gets moved around between different museums, but it's usually in the Jerusalem Museum. The Rosetta Stone is a different time of Egyptian. So even though it's claiming to be from 200 years BC, it's not 600 BC. So it's a different Egyptian, Reformed Egyptian. I think I've nailed this on the head enough. Charles Anthon, when he looks at it, he says, yeah, these characters do look ancient. And then he says, and they are Egyptian. He couldn't read Egyptian. Nobody could read Egyptian. But he is a professor, and he can see similarities, and he has a reputation to keep up. And that's the time, though, that he asks, and this is an account by someone who was attacking Joseph Smith and writing this up against him. But he says that when Martin was visiting Charles Anthon, so this is from Reverend John A. Clark, who wrote a book attacking Joseph Smith. But we get a lot of good details in this book, so I'm going to quote him a lot today. Upon my asking, he was shown a copy made. Actually, I'm going to have to just summarize some of these things. As soon as he says that they were found, he says, I cannot read a sealed book. And we know a lot of the Book of Mormon, a lot of the plates were sealed, and a lot of the history was sealed. But Charles Anthon and the other people that Joseph saw fulfill the prophecy of Isaiah 29. A vision of all will be come unto you as the words of a book that is sealed. And one who is learned says, I pray thee, read this. He says, I can't, it's sealed. And the book is delivered to him that is not learned, saying, read this, I pray thee. And he saith, I'm not learned. Wherefore the Lord said, for as much as this people draw near to me with their mouth, and their lips do honor me, but have removed their hearts far from me, and their fear toward me is taught by the precepts of men. Therefore, behold, I will proceed to do a marvelous work among this people, even a marvelous work and a wonder. And it is that marvelous work and a wonder that allow the family to move back into Joseph's property, and all the visitors and everybody else sneak in, and Emma learns how to get along, and they are able to translate the 116 pages shortly after that, and we'll talk about that next week.